Harl himself set up his headquarters in the French city of Mulhouse, to his increasing chagrin. Bird's commander, Rafi Eaton, recalls, "It's the middle of winter, horrible snow, bone-chilling cold, 20-something degrees below zero outside. Isser is furious, sitting in some boarding house in France beyond the Rhine. He shows me some pictures and says, 'This is the target, go kill him.'" The Birds operatives were exhausted after the innumerable operations connected with the German scientists that they had been assigned to in the previous months and the support they had been giving to Unit 188. Eventually, Eaton told Harl that in his opinion, the circumstances were not ripe for a targeted killing. "We needed to wait a bit to create a trap of our own, not just shoot people in the street. Give me a month," I told him. "I'll carry out the mission, and no one will know that I was even here." But Harl wouldn't listen. On January 21st, he dismissed the Birds and called in Mifrat, the Mossad targeted killing unit commanded by Yitzhak Shamir, in order to have Klein Wachter done away with. What Harl didn't know was that Valentin had grasped that Klein Wachter would be the Mossad's next target. He gave him a series of briefings, made sure he was constantly accompanied by an escort, and gave him an Egyptian military pistol. On February 20th, a Mossad lookout saw Klein Wachter setting out alone on the road from Lorch to Basel. Or is that Lorch? To Basel. They decided to make the hit when he got back. Shamir, who, together with Harl, commanded the operation in the field, assigned the job of firing the shots to a trained former Irgun assassin by the name of Akiva Cohen. Harl sent the German-speaking Zvi Aharoni along with him. They waited for the target to get back in the evening, but he didn't show up, and it was decided to call the operation off. Then everything went wrong. Klein Wachter finally did appear, and the cancellation order was suddenly reversed, but the execution of the entire action was hasty and amateurish. The Mifrat's operatives' car blocked Klein Wachter's, but the way both vehicles had stopped in the narrow road prevented the Mossad men from getting away after the operation. Aharoni got out of the car and went up to Klein Wachter, and as if to ask him for directions. The idea was to get him to open the window. He began doing so. Cohen, who approached Aharoni from behind, drew his gun, tried to aim it through the open window, and fired. But the bullet hit the glass and shattered it, then hit Klein Wachter's scarf, but it missed his body. For some unknown reason, the pistol didn't fire again. One theory is that the spring snapped. Another is that the bullet was a dud, and yet another is that the magazine got loose and fell out. Oh, shit. Aharoni saw that the plan had failed and yelled at everyone to make a run for it. They couldn't use their car, so they ran off in different directions to try to get waiting escape vehicles. Read poorly by Tom. Klein Wachter drew his pistols and began firing at the fleeing Israelis. He didn't hit anyone, but the entire operation was an embarrassing failure. Harl then launched a number of actions aimed at intimidating the scientists and their families, including anonymous letters threatening their lives and containing much information about them, as well as actual visits in the middle of the night to give similar warnings. These operations also failed dismally when the Swiss police arrested a Mossad operative by the name of Joseph Bengal after he had threatened Professor Gorke's daughter, Heidi. He was extradited to Germany, convicted, and sentenced to a short term in prison. Mossad agents, following the trial, had the disagreeable experience of watching as the missile project's security officer, the hulky Hermann Valentin, appeared at the proceedings with a smug smile, not even pretending to hide his pistol. By the spring of 1963, Harl's Mossad hadn't slowed, let alone ended, the Egyptians' progress towards rockets that could annihilate Israel. So, Harel then took two political subterfuge. He began leaking stories to the press, some true, some embellished, some outright lies, and in parentheses, that the Germans were helping Egypt produce atom bombs and deadly lasers. About Nazis, where have you heard that recently? About Nazis building weapons for Arabs to kill Jews. Harl was totally convinced that the German scientists were Nazis still determined to complete the final solution, and that the German authorities were aware of their activities but were doing nothing to stop them. The truth was that they were people who had become accustomed to the good life under the Third Reich and had become unemployed when it fell, and now were simply trying to make some easy money off the Egyptians. But Harl dragged the entire organization, and in fact the whole country, behind this obsession of his. Fan was left on. In order to prove his claims, Harl presented information gathered in Cairo about Dr. Hans Eisel and the butcher of Buchenwald, who had been involved in appalling experiments on Jewish inmates. He was designated a war criminal, but escaped trial and found a comfortable refuge in Egypt, where he became the physician of the German scientists. Harl also fingered a number of other Nazis in Cairo, though none of them belonged to the group of missile scientists. His goal was to publicly vilify Germany, in which Israel had a complicated relationship, a subject of much dispute internally. Relative matters, such as Ben-Gurion and his chief aide, Shimron Peres, maintained that... let me start that whole sentence over again. Relative moderates, such as Ben-Gurion and his chief aide, Shimron Peres, maintained that at the time when the United States was reluctant to provide Israel with all the military and economic aid it asked for, Israel could not afford to turn down assistance from the West German government, which came in the form of reparations and compensation agreement, and the sale of military equipment at a fraction of its real cost. Hardliners such as Golda Meir and Harl himself, on the other hand, rejected the notion that the Federal Republic of Germany was a new or different Germany. History, to their minds, had left a permanent stain. Harl also called in the editors' committee, that unique Israeli institution, then composed of top editors of the print and electronic media, who self-censored items in their publications at the request of the government. Harl asked the editors' committee to provide him with 3 journalists, whom he subsequently recruited into the Mossad. They were sent to Europe at the Mossad's expense to gather intelligence about the front companies that were buying equipment from the Egyptian project. Harl claimed he needed the journalists for operational reasons, but the truth was that he wanted to use their involvement in the materials they collected to launder information he had already possessed. As such, it could be disseminated to the foreign and Israeli media for the purpose of manufacturing newspaper reports that would create a climate suited to his purposes. Harl's read poorly by Tom. Take a breath real quick. Harl's stories generated a media frenzy and a growing sense of panic in Israel. Ben-Gurion tried to calm Harl down to no avail. He was not, in my opinion, quite sane, said Amos Manner, the Shin Bet chief at the time. It was something much more profound than obsession. You couldn't have a rational conversation about it with him. It ended, as most obsessions do. What it do? It ended, as most obsessions do, in Harl's own destruction. His publicity campaign, the frenzied newspaper stories he'd planted of Hitler's minions rising again, badly wounded Ben-Gurion. The Prime Minister was attacked for not having done enough to end the threat posed by the German scientists working in Egypt, a threat Israeli citizens saw as a clear and present danger to their very existence, and for leading his country into a conciliation with West Germany, which now seemed to be at least indirectly responsible for a new version of the final solution. On March 25th, 1963, Ben-Gurion summoned Harl to his office and demanded an explanation for a number of actions Harel had carried out vis-a-vis the local and international media without Ben-Gurion's approval. The conversation degenerated into a bitter debate over the Israeli government's policy towards Germany. The Prime Minister reminded Harel that he was supposed to implement government policy, not set it. Offended by the rebuke, Harel offered his resignation, confident the old man couldn't manage without him and would beg him to stay. Ben-Gurion thought otherwise. He accepted the resignation on the spot. Isser Harel's once brilliant career ended in a failed bluff and utter defeat. He was immediately replaced by Mir Amit, the chief of Amman.